What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and Carnage is back, and this story I think is one of the best Carnage stories I've ever read. I'm so excited to see what you guys think about this down in the comments section, right? Just phenomenal story. So what this does is this initially picks up with a guy by the name of Jonathan Shade, and I love his character over the course of this. He's so phenomenal, but he's basically responding to what is in effect a crime that's taken place. Now, one of the crazy things about this is we're kind of left this, or kind of given this sort of indication of what all is going on, that one of the local cops, right, just kind of one of the responding officers says, an anonymous caller left a tip a little before 6:30. Says there's an awful smell coming from the old abandoned fur factory in Del Rio. Officers arrived on site 12 minutes later. After they hurled, they called in homicide, who called in special cases, and here we are. And what we end up finding out is that this guy has basically, or at least a guy, has been killed and has been strung up. But it's not just an arbitrary thing. That in fact, literally what Jonathan says is like, it's the artist, right? The artist is back. And this guy's kind of strung up in a way to where it's arguably designed to send a message, right? That the nature of this is that there have been crimes like this that have been happening. This is not a one-off, and it's not a new thing. And in fact, Jonathan Shade has been chasing after the artist for seemingly quite some time. But the idea behind the way in which this guy's depicted, I'm not even gonna lie, man, looks like something out of Hellraiser. This dude looks like he was killed by Cenobites. I mean, it's kind of messed up, right? I mean, like, even like the coat he's wearing and whatnot is all just kind of sprawled out. And so the result of this is that he says, of course, or at least Jonathan says, that this is absolutely the artist, right? It's not somebody copycatting him or anything like that. I mean, Jonathan says, like, the MO fits, right? The motivation of this guy fits. He says, I mean, any good copycat would have gotten the canvas right, but the staging is meticulous, set up for a show, framed so we have a dramatic view walking in. Then there's the added touch of the fur coat in a fur factory. It all fits. This is our guy. And so it's one of these cool things because as that happens, one of the criminal investigators on the scene, I don't remember what these guys are called. It's what Barry Allen is, forensics guy. Like one of the forensics guy is basically like looking at the body, and then they end up realizing there's more to it, more to this corpse than what's going on. That in fact, it starts to burst open. And when that happens, all these butterflies come flying out of the body. I mean, it's pretty twisted and it's pretty morbid, but it's one of those things where he says like, yeah, like this is definitely, it's the artist. This is a performance, right? The theater of it all. He's an exhibitionist. He's putting on a show through these corpses that he's leaving behind. But what ends up going on here is he says that at the end of the day, this guy's not doing this show for us, right? We just happened to stumble upon these cases, but it's not as though this guy was like the Zodiac, right? Where like he killed somebody and then sent off a letter to the cops and was like, catch me if you can. It wasn't like that. Instead, the cops happened to stumble on what this guy was already doing. So the reality here is that this artist is basically doing this to these people in order to get the attention of someone else. And the question is asked, whose attention is he trying to get? And so what we end up doing is switching over to this old house with a guy named Dave Speakman who's been taken by the artist, right? And the artist says, do you know what my father said about his profession? And he says for over 40 years, the man was a mortician, a very good one. He spent his days making the dead more beautiful than they had ever been in life. He worked for the city too. So we got all the worst cases, prison beatings, murders, horrible accidents, victims abandoned and alone. And he says, when I was a little boy, he'd take me to work with him. I'd watch the whole day cleaning, stitching, sewing up bullet holes, and patching up ripped faces. And I'd ask him, why do you spend so much time making the dead look so beautiful? Why would they care? They're dead. And the response of his father is, my dear boy, all things must be beautiful in the kingdom of God. And so while I wouldn't necessarily go as far as to say this guy's got a religious motivation, it does fall perfectly in line with what could be considered a measure of abuse as a child. The reality here, and one of the things to know, is that as kids, there is a certain kind of life that we're supposed to live. Just because of the fact that between the ages of like 3 to 5, I think, and then like 7 to 13, we're at our most impressionable. The things that we see and the things that we hear they will have a profound effect on us, not just as kids, but going into our adult lives. And this guy was literally just surrounded by death. It's really the only thing he knows. But for reasons that aren't really just fully explained here yet, he's doing this to get the attention of someone. And so what he ends up doing is actually cutting Speakman open, and then basically it's bloodletting. Like he just starts like draining this guy's body of blood while he's still alive. And what he says here, he says, "In glorious and transformative death, I will make you beautiful." He says, "But I don't do this for your God or my father's. What do they know of beauty?" And he says, "I've been calling to him, you see. Ever since I saw the dragons in the sky, I knew they were gods, and I saw the mark of my God upon his head. On the right days, at the right times, I have taken life in his name and scrawled his spirals in blood. Do you hear me, I've asked? Do you see me, my God?" And that's when he's met by Carnage. And what we end up finding out here is that's the guy he's been hunting for. Like literally the artist has been going through and just killing these people in this way and creating those kind of spirals that he's seen because he's trying to get the attention of Carnage. The gods that he's talking about, the dragons in the sky, that was Null. And those were the symbiote dragons that he's talking about. So obviously this guy saw everything that was going on during the events of the King in Black storyline. It's so amazingly cool the way this is done. And so that's when Carnage, when he arrives on the scene, he basically Carnage has been following this guy and he's been keeping track of his work. But Carnage, as we know, is morally questionable at best and just lacks any kind of morality at worst. And so what he literally asks this guy is he says, you know, "Are you some kind of a person who's just a psycho fan? Are you just obsessed with this kind of thing? Or are you a fan? Are you a person who's a fan of my work?" And so when the two of them meet, what we end up doing is switching over to Jonathan Shade as he's basically following up with regards to Dave Speakman, who was ultimately discovered, right? He was found at the scene of the crime. He was almost completely out of blood. They managed to basically patch him up, get him the blood that he needed, and then save his life. But when he's here, what he says is, for the most part, he doesn't remember everything that had gone on. He knows that like this guy, the artist, was talking about his father. He knows that like the artist basically ended up meeting with what Dave Speakman calls the devil, right? Like that's what he refers to Carnage as. But it's one of those things where what he kind of babbles to a degree can be deciphered on some level, but for the most part, it's difficult to pick up. More so than that what the artist, a guy by the name of Kenneth Neely is his actual name, that what happens is when we jump back to the moment when he met Carnage, that literally what he says is like, "I followed your work for so very long, but there were only rumors. That Cletus Cassidy is gone. It's just you now by yourself, and I wanted to become your next host." And one of the funny things about this is that on the surface, and really to a degree, Carnage rejects him, right? Because what Carnage kind of says here is like, I mean, you can come along with me for the ride. Let me show you my work and the things that I've done. But what he ends up saying here is that for the most part, he's actually achieved a level of freedom without Cletus Cassidy that he ever could have imagined with Cletus Cassidy. And that's a very huge distinction here. And it's a really big moment for the Carnage symbiote. The reason being because over the course of Carnage's publication history, it's always been him and Cletus. That Cletus Cassidy and the Carnage relationship were always kind of provided to us as an answer to the question, what if like the Joker became Venom? What would that look like? And it's Cletus Cassidy and Carnage. That's the end result of what you get. And so the two always went hand in hand. But one of the things that I want you guys to notice here is that it's in stark contrast to the Venom symbiote. That unlike what we saw where the Venom symbiote had lost Eddie Brock as its host, and then ultimately lost Flash Thompson as its next host, and then Lee as its next host, that as the Venom symbiote was out there on its own, operating by itself, that it kind of ended up becoming a good guy, right? That it basically became a kind of superhero. Carnage has actually steeped deeper into insanity and madness as he's been there by himself. And in fact, what he's done here is when he brings Kenneth to the body or to the work that he's performed, it's on Hydro Man. Like literally he attacked Hydro Man. And of course, Hydro Man is a guy whose body is basically made of water now, right? Like water, like his molecular structure is literally just water. And so what Carnage ends up doing here is actually taking the essence of Hydro Man and then absorbing it into himself. Now, the reason why this matters is because when Hydro Man turns into his water form, that every molecule in his body literally just becomes water. But one of the molecules maintains the essence of what he is. This molecule is what Cletus Cassidy basically stole, right? The essence of what makes Hydro Man what he is. In doing so, the rest of Hydro Man's body literally just discorporates into water. But one of the things that Carnage says is that in absorbing Hydro Man, that Morris Bench never truly understood exactly what he was capable of and exactly what he could do. And even in this story, it is a bit murky. The only thing that really seems to happen here is that with the death of Hydro Man, that it basically creates this kind of portal, right? This almost sort of nexus. And so what ends up happening here is that with Jonathan Jonathan Shade, realizing that Kenneth Neely is basically the artist, that he ends up tracking Kenneth Neely down. And when he does, he literally arrives to where Kenneth Neely and Carnage are at. And so one of the interesting things about this is that the Carnage symbiote, really kind of operating outside of Cletus Kasady, is really just kind of figuring out what it's capable of. Because the reality here is that when Carnage was bonded to Cletus, in a lot of ways, it was limited by the mind of Cletus and Cletus' desire to simply just end life everywhere he found it. But now that Carnage is operating of its own accord, like what it says here, for example, is it asks Kenneth Neely about the idea of trophies. It says, like, you take trophies, don't you? Like, whenever it is that you do things, like Cletus Kasady would do that. And the response of Kenneth is, yes. He's like, I take pictures before and after their quote-unquote transformation. And the response of Carnage is, but that transformation is not limited to the victim, don't you see? For instance, this piece that I have taken from Hydro-Man, his power that made him water, a universal medium, I imbibe it now within myself, and in doing so, I too am changed. I'm taking a trophy, I too am transformed. And so it's one of these interesting things, because what it does is it seemingly allows him to absorb the powers of other people once he takes it. And so this is, by all standards of measurement, the effective death of Hydro-Man, or at least that appears to be the case, until such a time as somebody decides to bring him back. But with Jonathan Shade showing up here and then realizing what these guys are doing, he immediately goes in to try to like take down Kenneth Neely, not fully grasping what he's doing, and then is attacked by Carnage. But in seeing that Jonathan Shade is willing to just run into his own impending doom for the purpose of basically capturing Kenneth Neely, that Carnage sees him with a level of respect that he doesn't see for Kenneth. That Kenneth is a guy who's literally looking for the approval of Carnage. Jonathan Shade doesn't care. He'll do whatever it takes to get his man, even potentially ending his own life in the process. And so with that level of respect, what Carnage does is that with Jonathan Shade's body literally breaking down due to the onslaught of the powers of Hydro-Man that created this portal, right? His body's literally falling apart. That what Carnage does is he literally rips him to pieces and then imbues him with portions of the Carnage symbiote. And then he says, if you survive here, this should help you pull yourself together. And he says, if you truly want all that you pursue, show me how far you're willing to go. And so it's one of those cool things, because what it does is it saves the life of Jonathan Shade, and he wakes up in the hospital 2 days later. Now, what ended up going on here is that because Hydro-Man seemingly has a larger role going on, a whole bunch of suits show up out of nowhere, right? They literally start whisking away all these documents and all this evidence, anything to do with like Hydro-Man. They like literally like just guys and, you know, men in black, right? Guys in suits and black sunglasses from some unidentified agency just start grabbing all these things. But because of the fact that everything that's going on here is raising a lot more questions with the wrong kind of authorities, at least in the eyes of the police chief, that for the most part, Jonathan Shade has been banished from this particular case. And even when his partner shows up there and says, hey man, like, do you remember anything? Jonathan recalls almost everything that's going on, but then basically lies about it, right? And it's like, I don't really recall anything. More so than that, he sees the Carnage symbiote that's attached to him, and while it's not full on possession of him, what it does do is it imbues him with the memories of Cletus Kasady. Now, one of the things to keep in mind here, and this is something that was covered in The King of Black, in more recent years in Marvel Comics, they introduced the idea of codexes or codices, that whenever a symbiote bonds to a host, if for any reason that host is removed from the symbiote will maintain memories of that host in the form of a codex. And so essentially when Carnage had given a piece of itself to Jonathan Shade, it also imbued him with the codices of Cletus Kasady, hence the reason why he has his memories. And so it's one of those crazy moments, because what he ends up doing here is basically fleeing the hospital and then going into the case on his own. More so than that, he almost kind of leans into the symbiote to a degree, because he realizes that with the symbiote bonded to him, even though it's only a small portion, he's stronger, he's faster, he's able to heal quicker, he's more capable than he's ever been. And so he sees the symbiote, if anything, as a chance for him to basically use these powers to track down Kenneth. Now, of course, one of the other things to know is he does know that he's seeing the memories of Cletus Kasady, and he is aware of the fact that when he was in that location and he did see Kenneth Neely, that he was also in the presence of Carnage, right? So he knows who these guys are, and he knows what they're capable of. And so what he ends up doing is traveling to go see his partner, right, to go see Booth, and then starts looking over the different documents that Booth has at his disposal, because again, basically Jonathan Shade can't be a part of the investigation, so none of the information is being provided to him. And where Booth is a little on the fence of kind of like, man, I don't really know if you should be doing this, the reality is that they're partners. Cops help each other out. And so basically he kind of turns a blind eye while Jonathan goes through all the different documents and tries to understand what's going on. But he also basically starts spilling the beans to a degree on everything that he quote unquote remembers. And I put that in quotations because again, he remembered everything. He just lied to Booth about it and then says, well, now it's all just starting to come back to me and that kind of a thing. But again, what he really kind of hits at here is for the most part for Carnage, it's not really him trying to find like Cletus Cassidy and trying to recapture the glory days. Instead, it's Carnage trying to see if he can push the limits of what he's capable of. He's trying to become more powerful. And you could even go so far as to argue he's trying to become the new King in Black to get to the level of power that Null the symbiote god seemed to have. And so jumping back to Carnage and those guys, what we end up doing is picking up with them once they get to Spot. Now Spot is a major villain out there who in a lot of ways is kind of overlooked. And that's one of the things that I'm hoping you're noticing here, that with Hydro Man, with Spot, that what we're seeing is Ram V, the guy who's writing the story, actually indirectly elevating these guys to a whole new level of power that we didn't really know they had before, which may be a status quo going forward. I'm not entirely sure. But what Carnage does when he basically ends up meeting with Spot is that Spot, of course, being a villain himself and not really wanting any of that smoke that Carnage is dishing out, ultimately says like, look man, if what you want are spots and you want to access the Spot dimension, I can just give it to you. But the response of Carnage is, I'm not looking to gain passage, I'm looking to take your powers. And so literally, he just starts attacking him. Now, one of the coolest things about Spot is being able to access the Spot dimension, create these little portals. He's under any normal circumstance more than a match for Carnage. The Carnage can't actually get this guy because he keeps creating these little portals that allow him to kind of get in and out, to dodge around, different things like that, and Carnage just can't catch up. But because Spot is so hyper-focused on the symbiote, he doesn't even notice Kenneth Neely is there. And Kenneth is able to get his hands on Spot just long enough for Carnage to catch up to him, right? To get his hands on him. And then Carnage literally rips this guy to pieces. And when he does, he basically kills him, no pun intended, on the spot. You guys had to know that was coming. But in doing that, he also seizes control of Spot's powers, right? He seizes control of his abilities. And so that's when the question's asked by Kenneth Neely, like, what is all this for? Like, what are we doing all this for? What's the greater purpose here? Like, there's got to be something going on. Like, what are your motivations in this whole thing? And so before we get an answer to that question, what we do is we jump back to Jonathan Shade as he's kind of continuing on this journey. He's sort of back to work, really more desk duty than anything else. But as he's there, he starts hearing the voice of Cletus Cassidy in his head. In the same way that the Venom symbiote talks to Eddie Brock, Cletus Cassidy is talking to Jonathan Shade. And it's kind of a crazy thing, but it's also a great thing at the same time. Because one, it gives Jonathan Shade the appearance that he's going crazy because he's basically screaming at somebody who's not there, right? Just screaming at a voice in his head. But realizing that it's Cletus Cassidy who's talking to him, and Cletus Cassidy was at one point the host of the Carnage symbiote, that what Cletus says, and it's even a little ambiguous because he kind of seems to be playing a little bit of the hero role to a degree, right? He's like, if what you want to do is you want to catch Carnage and you want to catch Kenneth, then I know exactly where to take you, because what Carnage is doing was initially my plan. It was initially what it was that I intended to do. But ultimately I was killed before before the Carnage symbiote and myself could achieve this goal in the first place. And so the other part of this though, and this is one of the things that makes the relationship between Cletus Cassidy and Jonathan Shade so cool, is that Cletus again is very much just a straight up psychopath, right? I mean, the guy just lacks any real morality at all. And so oftentimes, like for example, when he goes to check out the most recent case where you had Kenneth Neely and Carnage who had just kind of been on this crime, you know, that didn't necessarily have to do with Spot himself, but had to do with people that they had killed before they caught up to Spot, that Booth is there and Booth is investigating. And that in this moment when he feels frustrated by Booth, like Cletus Cassidy shows him this image of Jonathan just beating Booth to death, right? Like killing this guy. And so those are the kind of images that he has to contend with. More so than that though, and it's one of the cool things that goes on here, is that there are little clues that are kind of left behind where Carnage kind of seems to be playing this game of like, can you catch me? It's not an overt game, right? It's not like he has this map drawn on a wall with an arrow that says like, I'm gonna be here in like 36 hours. It's not that simple. But what Jonathan did find was a map that was slightly out of place. And just because it was out of place in a bit of a weird way, drew his attention to it. Now, a lot of that's just because he's a detective, and he's trained to look for things that are slightly out of place. And what he finds here is a map. And when Cletus sees the map, that's when he says, or at least the Cletus personality in the mind of Jonathan sees the map, that's when he says, that's where we need to go. We need to go to that location because now I know exactly what it is that Carnage is doing. And so picking up with Carnage, once they're at this, basically this observatory, that what he does is he talks to one of the local scientists, right? One of the people who were there. And he says, you see, Dr. Holliday, we watched you on the television speaking about Einstein, Rosen bridges and sending particles across dimensions. Then there was a spark of an idea, the beginnings of a thought, when the dragons came. Then under the rapture of a Clintar god, as we ran amok, we had a taste. Of course, he's talking about himself and Cletus when Carnage and Cletus were bonded. And he says, we had a taste of the power that we had never imagined. Then Venom, Eddie Brock, they became the King in Black. Do you know how it feels to hold the power of a god in your hand and then watch someone you hate take it for their own? So Cletus began to think of a plan, a way to elevate ourselves. If we could not be God, then we would be the thing that kills God. We would be absolute and true Carnage. But then Cletus never acted on it before he went away. And I thought to myself, what if he was only holding me back? So go on, Dr. Holliday, power up your machine while I use what I took from Morris Bench and Jonathan Owen, right, the Spot, to reach across space, worlds, universes, to find just how far I can truly go. And so when this machine's fired up, using a combination of the powers of the Spot as well as Hydro Man, what Carnage does is when this portal rips open, he jumps through it alongside Kenneth Neely. And in essence, Carnage seems to enter into the multiverse. With that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this video to an end. God, I told you it was an amazing story. Thank you all for watching, and I'll catch you all later. Peace.